Fionna Campbell stands behind the counter of a coffee shop in a city that moves with the particular rhythm of lives being lived with purpose. Each person seems possessed of some internal compass guiding them toward meaning. She watches them serve lattes and cappuccinos to people who have places to be, things to accomplish, identities that fit them like well-worn clothes. Fionna exists in a different state entirely, suspended in the peculiar torture of knowing that her entire existence was once someone else's fantasy, and now she must somehow construct a real life from the ashes of that revelation. This is where Fionna's story begins, in the grinding mundanity of a world without magic, without adventure, without the epic scope that once defined every moment of her existence. Except that existence was never truly hers. She was a character in the Ice King's fanfiction, a creation born from Simon Petrikov's magical madness, given form and consciousness, but not agency, not true selfhood. And now she must be real, must be human, must navigate a world that feels simultaneously too small and overwhelmingly complex. The psychology of discovering you were fictional presence, a unique form of existential crisis that goes beyond typical questions of meaning and purpose. Fionna must grapple not only with why am I here, but with was I ever really here at all? Her memories of adventure, of heroism, of a life filled with magical significance now carry the taint of unreality. They happened, in some sense. She experienced them, felt them, built her sense of self around them. But they were scripted by someone else's loneliness, someone else's need to create worlds where he wasn't alone, where magic could solve problems that in reality remain stubbornly unsolvable. The apartment Fionna shares with Cake is a study in arrested development, decorated with the remnants of a life that never truly was. Posters of adventures that may or may not have happened. Weapons that are now just collectibles, drained of any magical purpose. The space exists in a state of nostalgic preservation, a museum to a self that Fionna isn't sure she has the right to claim. Every object in that apartment asks the same question. If you were created to be a hero, what are you supposed to be when the story ends? Depression in the wake of such a revelation takes a particular shape. It's not simply sadness or lack of motivation, though Fionna experiences both of these in abundance. It's a more fundamental disconnection from the concept of mattering, of having weight in the world. When your entire existence was entertainment for someone else, how do you convince yourself that your current choices, your current struggles, your current attempts at building a life carry any real significance? The barista job isn't just boring, it's ontologically empty, a placeholder activity in a placeholder life. Cake, her companion and sister in every way that matters, exists in a different psychological space. As a regular cat now, stripped of her magical shape-shifting abilities, Cake has adapted to mundane reality with the pragmatism of someone who never questioned her own realness. She was magic, now she's not, and life continues. But even in her adaptation, there's a restlessness, a sense of potential compressed into an ordinary form. Cake doesn't philosophize about existence. She experiences it directly, and right now, that experience feels constrained, limited, smaller than it should be. The relationship between Fionna and Cake represents one of the few genuine, uncomplicated goods in Fionna's life. This bond wasn't created by the Ice King's imagination, or if it was, it has transcended its origins to become something authentically theirs. They navigate their tiny apartment and their tiny lives together. Two beings trying to figure out how to exist in a world that doesn't seem to need heroes, doesn't seem to need magic, doesn't seem to need them to be anything other than ordinary. But ordinariness requires a kind of peace that Fionna hasn't achieved. To be contentedly ordinary, you need to believe that ordinary life has value, that small joys and simple pleasures constitute a life worth living. Fionna intellectually understands this concept, can see it working for the people around her, but she can't feel it. Every moment of her mundane existence is shadowed by the memory, or the idea of the memory, of a life that mattered more, that felt more, that was more. The city itself becomes a character in Fionna's psychological landscape, a maze of sameness, where every street looks like every other street, where routine replaces adventure, where the biggest challenge of any given day is getting to work on time or remembering to buy groceries. In Adventure Time's land of Oo, geography was magical, impossible, constantly surprising. Here, the world operates according to physics and urban planning, predictable and mapped and known. Fionna's boss at the coffee shop exists as a minor antagonist, not through any particular cruelty, but through the simple fact of representing the system that Fionna must now navigate. Schedules, employee reviews, customer service standards. These are the quests of her new reality, and they offer no magical swords as rewards, no experience points, no narrative satisfaction. They offer a paycheck that barely covers rent, and the abstract promise that this is what adult life looks like, that she should be grateful to have employment, to have stability, to have normalcy. The customers who flow through the coffee shop are sleepwalking through their own routines, or so it appears to Fionna's jaded perspective. In reality, each of them carries their own complexities, their own internal adventures, their own struggles with meaning and purpose. But Fionna can't see this yet. Her depression creates a filter that renders everyone else as extras in a play where she herself barely rates as a supporting character. The psychological isolation of this worldview is profound, cutting Fionna off from the very connections that might begin to restore her sense of purpose. At night, in the apartment she shares with Cake, Fionna sometimes tries to remember the adventures she thinks she had. Were they real? The question torments her. She can recall the feeling of swinging a sword, the rush of battling monsters, the satisfaction of saving kingdoms. But memories created by someone else's imagination carry a different weight than memories earned through genuine experience. They're real to her in the sense that she experienced them, but they're not real in the way that this morning's terrible coffee and rude customer were real. This ontological confusion creates a split in Fionna's sense of self. There's the Fionna who was a hero, brave and strong and certain of her purpose. And there's the Fionna who serves coffee and struggles to pay rent and can't seem to feel anything deeply anymore. The gap between these two versions of herself is where her depression lives, in the space between who she thinks she was and who she's afraid she actually is. Cake watches this struggle with the particular concern of someone who loves Fionna but can't fully understand what she's going through. Cake misses magic too, misses the ability to transform and fly and be more than just a normal cat. But Cake's sense of self wasn't as thoroughly tied to those abilities. Cake was Cake before magic, during magic, and after magic. Fionna, on the other hand, doesn't know who Fionna is when you strip away the adventure and the heroism and the magical purpose. The mundane world demands a different kind of strength than the magical one did. It requires the ability to find meaning in repetition, to construct purpose from nothing, to wake up each day and choose to engage with life, even when life offers no obvious rewards for that engagement. This is the heroism of ordinary existence, but it's a heroism that Fionna hasn't learned to recognize or value. She's still operating on the logic of her former life, where heroism meant dramatic action, visible results, clear victories over obvious evil. But there are no obvious villains in Fionna's current life. There's just the grinding weight of existence, the thousand small indignities of service work and financial stress and social isolation. The enemy is formlessness itself, the lack of structure and purpose that leaves Fionna drifting through her days without anchor or direction. How do you fight an enemy that's really just the absence of meaning? How do you win a battle against your own disconnection from life? The depression that characterizes Fionna's state is not simply a mood, it's a philosophical position. It's the logical conclusion of someone who has looked at their own existence and found it wanting in realness, in significance, in the kind of weight that makes suffering worthwhile. Fionna is not wrong to feel this way, given the unique circumstances of her creation and current reality. But she's also not seeing clearly, not recognizing the ways in which her current life, however mundane, is more genuinely hers than her magical adventures ever were. This is the trap of nostalgia, especially nostalgia for a past that may not have been fully real. It creates an impossible standard against which the present must compete. Every ordinary moment is measured against extraordinary memories, and every ordinary moment loses that comparison. Fionna is caught in this trap, unable to move forward because she's constantly looking backward, unable to invest in her present because her past, real or imagined, was so much more vivid. The apartment becomes a physical manifestation of this temporal confusion. Old posters and weapons exist alongside cheap furniture and unpaid bills. The heroic past and the mundane present occupy the same space without integrating, without forming a coherent narrative. Fionna exists between these two states, unable to fully inhabit either one. She's not the hero she remembers being, but she's also not successfully becoming whoever she's supposed to be now. Cake's presence offers the only real comfort in this existence. At least Fionna isn't alone in her displacement from magic, from adventure, from a life that felt significant. Cake understands, even if she processes that understanding differently. They're both exiles from a magical world, trying to make sense of an ordinary one. The bond between them is one of the few things that feels unambiguously real to Fionna, uncomplicated by questions of origin or authenticity. The world outside the apartment window continues its indifferent operation. People go to work, fall in love, pursue goals, experience joy and suffering and everything in between. The universe does not care about Fionna's existential crisis. It does not pause to acknowledge her unique ontological situation. It simply continues, and Fionna must either find a way to continue with it or be left behind, paralyzed by questions that have no satisfying answers. This is where we find Fionna Campbell, stuck in a life that feels simultaneously too real and not real enough, mourning a past she's not sure she has the right to mourn, unable to imagine a future that doesn't feel like a betrayal of who she thinks she was. She is depressed, isolated, and fundamentally disconnected from the world around her. She is waiting for something to happen, for some external force to give her life meaning again, because she has forgotten, or never learned, how to create that meaning for herself. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday that should have been like every other Tuesday, Cake transforms. The thing about living in a world drained of magic is that you forget what magic feels like. Fionna has her memories, confused and possibly false as they are, but actual magic, the visceral experience of it, has been absent from her life for so long that when it returns, it's almost unrecognizable. Almost, but not quite. Because when Cake suddenly transforms in their apartment, stretching and morphing and becoming something more than a regular cat, Fionna's body remembers even if her mind struggles to process. Cake's transformation is not gradual or gentle. Magic doesn't seep back into her slowly, allowing for adjustment and preparation. It erupts, bursting forth with the force of something that has been compressed and denied for too long. One moment, Cake is a normal cat, lounging in a patch of sunlight and contemplating whether to nap now or nap later. The next moment, she's stretching, expanding, her form becoming fluid and impossible, defying every law of physics that has governed their mundane world. The psychological impact on Fionna is immediate and disorienting. For years, she's questioned the reality of her memories, wondered if the adventures she recalls were genuine experiences or implanted fictions. Cake's transformation is undeniable proof that magic is real, that their shared past wasn't entirely imagined, that the extraordinary is possible. This should be a moment of validation, of relief. Instead, it's terrifying. Because if magic is real again, then Fionna's carefully constructed mundane existence, miserable as it is about to be destroyed. Cake, for her part, experiences the return of her shape-shifting abilities with pure, uncomplicated joy. She has been compressed into the form of a regular cat, forced to exist within the narrow confines of ordinary feline capabilities, and the sudden expansion of possibility is ecstatic. She can stretch, she can fly, she can transform into anything she can imagine. The constraints that have defined her existence for years suddenly dissolve, and Cake embraces her restored nature with the enthusiasm of someone who never doubted she was meant to be magical. But magic doesn't return in isolation. It brings with it attention, and not the welcome kind. The moment Cake transforms, alarms sound in dimensions and bureaucracies that Fionna didn't know existed. There are entities whose job is to monitor unauthorized magical activity, to maintain the boundaries between magical and non-magical realities, to ensure that worlds that are supposed to be mundane stay mundane. Cake's transformation is a violation of cosmic order, and cosmic order has enforcers. The apartment, which moments ago was a depressing but stable environment, becomes a crime scene in the eyes of the multiverse. Fionna and Cake don't understand this yet, don't recognize that they've just triggered a cascade of events that will fundamentally alter their reality. They're still processing the immediate shock of Cake's transformation, still trying to understand what this means for their daily existence. Can Cake transform back? Should she? Is this permanent? Is it safe? Fionna's response to the situation reveals the depth of her disengagement from life. A normal person might be thrilled by the return of magic, excited by the possibilities it represents. But Fionna's first instinct is concern bordering on dread. Magic means adventure, and adventure means danger, and danger means she might be called upon to be the hero she's not sure she ever truly was. The mundane world was limiting and depressing, but it was also safe, predictable, controllable. Magic is none of those things. Cake doesn't share these concerns. She's stretching across the apartment, testing her abilities, relearning the feeling of transforming her body into different shapes and configurations. It's like remembering a language you used to speak fluently but haven't used in years. The grammar is still there, buried in muscle memory and instinct. Cake becomes a ladder, a parachute, a key, each transformation executed with increasing confidence and joy. The contrast between Fionna's anxiety and Cake's exuberance highlights their different relationships with magic and mundanity. For Cake, the mundane world was a prison, a forced limitation of her true nature. She adapted because she had to, but she never accepted it as right or permanent. For Fionna, The mundane world was simultaneously a prison and a refuge, a place where she didn't have to live up to the impossible standard of being a hero, where her ordinariness was not just accepted but required. But magical transformations don't happen in a vacuum, especially not in a world that's supposed to be non-magical. The fabric of reality around Fionna and Cake's apartment begins to behave strangely. Objects float for no reason. Colours become more saturated. The laws of physics, which have governed every moment of Fionna's mundane existence, start treating themselves as suggestions rather than requirements. The mundane world is rejecting the magical intrusion, or the magical intrusion is reshaping the mundane world, and the result is chaos. Fionna tries to process this through the framework of her barista job and her rent-paying existence. How does she explain this to her landlord? How does she go to work tomorrow when her cat has become a shape-shifting magical being? The absurdity of trying to maintain normalcy in the face of the supernatural would be funny if it wasn't so genuinely disorienting. Fionna's depression has trained her to see the world as fixed and unchanging, and now that worldview is literally falling apart around her. The apartment's walls suddenly feel too thin, too permeable. Fionna has the unsettling sensation of being watched, of their reality being observed from outside by entities she can't see or comprehend. This is not paranoia. The moment Cake transformed, their world became visible to cosmic bureaucracies that monitor such things, and those bureaucracies have protocols for dealing with unauthorized magic. Fionna and Cake are about to become targets, though they don't know it yet. Cake experiments with her renewed abilities, transforming into increasingly elaborate configurations. She becomes a complex geometric shape, then a perfect copy of Fionna, then something abstract and impossible to describe. Each transformation is executed with the confidence of someone rediscovering a fundamental aspect of their identity. This is who Cake is, who she was always meant to be. The years as a regular cat were an aberration, a false state imposed by external forces. For Fionna, watching Cake's joy is complicated. Part of her is happy for her sister, genuinely pleased that Cake has regained something essential that was taken from her. But part of Fionna is also deeply unsettled, recognizing that Cake's transformation represents the end of their shared mundane existence. They can't both be magical beings living in a non-magical world. Either the world will reject them, or they'll have to leave the world, and neither option feels safe. The magical energy emanating from Cake's transformations begins to affect Fionna as well. Though more subtly, colours seem brighter to her eyes. Sounds have a crystalline quality they lacked before. Her own body feels different, lighter somehow, as if gravity is exerting slightly less force than it should. Fionna doesn't have Cake's overt magical abilities, or at least she hasn't displayed any yet, but the proximity to magic is changing her, reawakening neural pathways that have been dormant. This reawakening is not entirely pleasant. Fionna's depression has been, in part, a protective numbness, a way of not feeling too much in a world that offered little to feel good about. But magic doesn't respect that numbness. It insists on full engagement, on presence, on the kind of aliveness that Fionna has been avoiding. She can feel her defences crumbling, can feel emotions that she's kept carefully suppressed beginning to surface, and it's overwhelming. And then they hear it, a sound that doesn't belong in their world, a mechanical whirring that suggests technology beyond anything mundane reality contains. Something is coming for them, drawn by Cake's magical signature, intent on restoring order to a world that's supposed to be non-magical. Fionna and Cake don't know what's coming yet, but they can sense it. The adventure they've been avoiding, or the adventure Fionna's been avoiding and Cake's been longing for, is about to find them whether they're ready or not. The Scarab has arrived. The Scarab is not evil in any traditional sense. It does not derive pleasure from causing suffering, does not harbour malice toward the beings it hunts. It is an enforcer of rules so fundamental that they predate most of the entities in the multiverse. The Scarab exists to maintain boundaries, to ensure that unauthorized beings do not cross between worlds, that non-magical realities remain non-magical, that the cosmic order established by higher powers is preserved. In this capacity, the Scarab is impersonal, precise, and absolutely merciless. When Cake's transformation triggers alarms in the Scarab's detection systems, the response is automatic and inevitable. An unauthorized magical entity is active in a designated non-magical reality. This cannot be tolerated. The Scarab initiates pursuit protocols with the dispassionate efficiency of a machine designed for a single purpose. It does not consider Fionna's depression, or Cake's joy, or the complex circumstances that led to this moment. It sees only violation and correction. The psychology of being hunted by an entity that views you as a category error rather than a person is uniquely dehumanizing. The Scarab does not hate Fionna and Cake. It doesn't acknowledge them as subjects worthy of emotion at all. They are anomalies, problems to be solved, glitches in reality that must be corrected. This lack of personal animosity somehow makes the Scarab more terrifying than a traditional villain. You can potentially reason with hatred, find common ground with an enemy. But how do you negotiate with enforcement itself? The Scarab's arrival in Fionna and Cake's world is marked by a systematic wrongness. Reality bends around its presence, struggling to accommodate something that exists outside normal dimensional parameters. The apartment building groans, walls cracking not from physical force, but from the strain of containing an entity that shouldn't exist in this context. Fionna feels it before she sees it, a pressure in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm, except the storm is mechanical and cosmic and absolutely focused on her and Cake. When the Scarab materializes, it does so with mechanical precision. Its form is insectoid, efficient, designed for function rather than aesthetics. Every component serves a purpose in the pursuit and correction of unauthorized dimensional travelers. It scans the apartment, its sensors cataloging Cake's magical signature, Fionna's connection to magical realities, the residual energy that marks them both as violators of the cosmic order. The Scarab's verdict is immediate and final. They must be eliminated or returned to their proper dimensional designation. Fionna's response to this threat reveals how unprepared she is for actual adventure. In her memories, real or imagined, she was brave and capable, facing danger with confidence and skill. But that Fionna, if she ever existed, is not accessible in this moment. The Fionna, who actually faces the Scarab, is terrified, frozen, her body refusing to engage with the kind of threat that requires physical courage rather than the passive endurance she's been practicing for years. Cake, conversely, responds to danger with the same enthusiasm she brought to her transformation. She immediately shifts into combat mode, her body becoming a weapon, a shield, a tool for escape. Cake's psychology doesn't include the kind of existential doubt that paralyzes Fionna. Cake acts, adapts, survives. This difference in their responses creates tension even as they try to work together to evade the Scarab's pursuit. The apartment becomes a battlefield, but a strange one where the combatants are not equally matched in understanding or capability. Fionna and Cake are fighting for their lives using improvisation and desperation. The Scarab is executing protocols established eons ago, its every action predetermined by cosmic law. This asymmetry creates a dynamic where Fionna and Cake's only advantage is unpredictability, their ability to make choices that deviate from optimal strategy because they don't know what optimal strategy is. As the chase intensifies, Fionna is forced to access parts of herself that have been dormant. Adrenaline overrides depression's paralysis. Survival instinct overrides existential questioning. She moves, fights, runs, not because she's suddenly become the hero she remembers being, but because the alternative is death or capture, and even her damaged will to live is stronger than either of those options. This is not heroism, it's desperation, but in the moment, the distinction doesn't matter. The Scarab is relentless. It follows them through the building, through the streets, adjusting its pursuit patterns to account for every evasive maneuver. Its mechanical mind runs probability calculations, predicting likely escape routes and cutting them off before Fionna and Cake can exploit them. The chase has a mathematical quality, the Scarab constantly narrowing the possibility space until capture becomes inevitable. But then something unexpected happens. The world itself begins to reject the Scarab. The mundane reality that the Scarab is ostensibly protecting recognizes the Scarab as a greater violation than Fionna and Cake. The Scarab's presence is causing more damage to the fabric of the non-magical world than Cake's transformation did. Reality starts to glitch around the Scarab, not in response to magic, but in response to the Scarab's own cosmic wrongness. This gives Fionna and Cake a brief window. They crash through a doorway that shouldn't exist, stumble through a space that connects to somewhere else, somewhere that isn't their world at all. The transition is disorienting and violent, reality folding around them in ways that make no geometric sense. They're falling or flying or moving in directions that don't have names in three-dimensional space. The Scarab's mechanical screech follows them, but the sound becomes distorted, stretched across dimensional boundaries. And then they're somewhere else entirely, not their mundane world, not the land of Ooo, but a space between spaces, a cosmic waiting room that exists outside normal reality. They've stumbled into the time room, into Prismo's domain, and nothing will ever be the same. Prismo exists in a state of perpetual paradox, a wish-granting entity who cannot grant his own wish for freedom, a cosmic being who experiences loneliness despite constant visitors, a prisoner who serves as jailer to countless other prisoners in the time room's crystalline cells. He spends his existence in a cosmic apartment that exists outside normal space-time, where the rules of physics are negotiable and reality bends to accommodate the impossible. When Fionna and Cake crash into his domain, pursued by the Scarab and desperate for any kind of intervention, Prismo is initially more intrigued than concerned. The psychology of an immortal wish-granter is complex and often overlooked. Prismo has seen countless beings, heard countless desires, witnessed the full spectrum of what creatures want when given the opportunity to have anything. This exposure has given him a particular wisdom about the gap between what people think they want and what they actually need. It's also left him profoundly isolated, because intimacy is difficult when you're a cosmic function, a mechanism for translating desire into reality. Fionna and Cake's arrival is irregular in ways that immediately capture Prismo's attention. They're not here to make a wish, at least not initially. They're fleeing, which means they're in active violation of cosmic law, which means helping them comes with consequences that even Prismo, with his considerable cosmic authority, will have to navigate carefully. But there's something about them, about Fionna's obvious psychological distress and Cake's fierce protective energy, that resonates with Prismo's own complicated relationship with existence. The time room itself responds to Fionna and Cake's presence with subtle shifts. The space is designed to accommodate impossibility, so their particular flavor of dimensional displacement doesn't destabilize it the way their presence destabilized the mundane world. Here, they can exist without causing reality to glitch and fracture. This immediate sense of safety, even temporary safety, allows Fionna to partially lower her defenses, to stop running for long enough to actually process what's happening to her. Prismo's manner is deceptively casual, an affectation he's cultivated over eons of existence. He speaks to Fionna and Cake as if they're old friends dropping by for a visit, rather than desperate fugitives who've just violated fundamental cosmic laws. This casualness is therapeutic in itself, providing a counterpoint to the mechanical seriousness of the Scarab and the overwhelming intensity of their situation. Prismo treats their crisis as manageable, which makes it feel slightly more manageable. But Prismo isn't simply being kind. He's calculating, in the way that cosmic entities calculate, running probability matrices and considering consequences that stretch across multiple timelines and realities. Helping Fionna and Cake means defying the Scarab, which means defying the authority structures that govern dimensional travel. Prismo has a complicated relationship with authority, being simultaneously subject to it and, in his own domain, a source of it. He can help them, but doing so will have costs. Fionna, still reeling from the chase and the displacement and the years of depression that left her unprepared for any of this, struggles to articulate what she needs. She doesn't even know what she needs. Escape from the Scarab, obviously, but beyond that? Does she want to return to the mundane world, assuming that's even possible now? Does she want to find the land of Oo, the magical realm of her memories that may or may not be real? Does she want to cease existing entirely, which has been a background desire for longer than she's willing to admit? Cake, more pragmatic, asks Prismo directly. Can he make the Scarab stop chasing them? Can he wish them into safety? Prismo's response is complicated, bounded by the rules that govern his existence. He can grant wishes, but wishes come with prices, and the price for undoing cosmic law enforcement might be higher than Fionna and Cake can pay. There are limits to what even Prismo can do without triggering consequences that cascade across the multiverse. The conversation reveals something important about Prismo's character. Despite his cosmic power, despite his ability to reshape reality through wish granting, he's fundamentally lonely and sympathetic to other lonely beings. He recognizes in Fionna someone who's been displaced from meaning, who exists in a state of existential homelessness similar to his own cosmic imprisonment. This recognition creates a bond that goes beyond simple helper and helped. Prismo sees something of himself in Fionna's struggle. He offers them sanctuary, at least temporarily. The time room can shield them from the Scarab's tracking, can provide a space where they can rest and recover and figure out their next move. But sanctuary isn't a permanent solution. Eventually they'll have to leave, and when they do, the Scarab will be waiting. Unless they can find a way to fundamentally resolve their status as dimensional violations, they'll spend the rest of their existence running. Prismo mentions Simon Petrikov almost casually, asks if Fionna knows him, if she understands his connection to the Ice King, if she's aware of his current psychological state. Fionna has vague awareness of Simon, memories that might be real or might be Ice King fanfiction made manifest, but she doesn't know him personally, doesn't understand why Prismo is bringing him up. Prismo explains, carefully, that Simon is dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, through the erosion of will to live. He's a man who survived his curse, only to discover that survival wasn't actually what he wanted. And Prismo thinks, though he's not certain, that maybe Simon and Fionna and Cake could help each other. Simon needs a reason to engage with life again. Fionna and Cake need a guide through the multiverse, someone who understands its rules and dangers. It's not a perfect solution, but perfect solutions don't exist in a multiverse built on chaos and magic. Simon Petrikov sits in his apartment surrounded by the archaeological evidence of a life he can barely recognize as his own. Academic papers with his name on them, written by a version of himself that no longer exists. Photographs of Betty Groff, the woman he loved and lost in ways so complicated that even thinking about it requires navigating a labyrinth of magic and sacrifice and time travel and cosmic intervention. The apartment is clean, organized, maintained with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions of living without actually being alive. This is depression in its most insidious form, the kind that doesn't announce itself with visible breakdowns or dramatic gestures. Simon gets up, he showers, he eats, he maintains his living space. To an outside observer, he might appear to be functioning. But functioning is not the same as living, and Simon knows the difference intimately. He is a man performing the role of being alive while waiting, with increasing impatience for permission to stop. The psychology of grief becomes exponentially more complicated when the lost loved one isn't simply dead, but cosmically transformed. Betty didn't die in a way that Simon's mind can process and eventually accept. She merged with Golb, became something beyond human comprehension, sacrificed her very existence to save him from the curse of the Ice Crown. How does one grieve someone who became a god? How does one move on from a loss that was simultaneously an act of ultimate love and ultimate horror? Simon can't. That's the simple answer. He has tried in the years since Betty's transformation to construct some kind of life, some kind of purpose, some reason to continue existing. But every attempt has felt hollow, a pantomime of meaning performed for an audience of one who isn't convinced by his own act. The world saved Betty from him, or saved him from the crown, depending on how you frame the narrative. But nobody saved Simon from the aftermath, from the particular torture of being rescued at a cost he never wanted to pay. The Ice King years have left additional psychological scars that Simon is still processing. For centuries, he existed in a state of magical madness, his personality overwritten by the crown's curse, his memories fragmented and confused. The things he did as Ice King, the princesses he kidnapped, the kingdoms he terrorized, these actions were not his exactly, but they were performed by his body under his name. How much responsibility does he bear for the actions of his cursed self? This question haunts Simon in the quiet moments. More than that, the Ice King was, in his own twisted way, happy, delusional, yes, but actively engaged with the world, pursuing goals however misguided, feeling emotions however inappropriate. Simon remembers that happiness the way you might remember a dream, uncertain whether it was real or simply a convincing simulation of feeling. And there's a terrible temptation in that memory, the seductive pull of madness, as an escape from the unbearable clarity of his current understanding. Simon's suicidal ideation is not impulsive or dramatic. It's a constant background hum, a standing offer that his mind presents to him multiple times a day. He could simply stop. Stop eating, stop maintaining his health, stop engaging with the few people who still reach out to him. the world would continue without him, barely noticing his absence. This thought is not comforting, exactly, but it has a certain appeal. The promise of finally being relieved of the burden of consciousness. But Simon doesn't act on these thoughts, not yet. There's a distinction between wanting to die and wanting to kill yourself, and Simon exists in that narrow space. He's waiting, though he couldn't articulate what he's waiting for. Permission, perhaps, a sign, or maybe just the erosion of whatever final resistance keeps him tethered to existence. He's not choosing life, exactly, but he's not quite choosing death either. He's in limbo, and limbo at least requires no decisions. When Simon receives Prismo's invitation, it arrives with the emotional impact of a grocery list. The cosmic wishmaster wants to see him, needs his help with something involving dimensional travelers and cosmic law enforcement. Under normal circumstances, this would be the kind of adventure that might spark some interest, some flicker of engagement with existence. But Simon has moved beyond the reach of normal motivations. The prospect of adventure, of being needed, of having purpose, these things that might motivate a functional person, simply register as additional burdens he lacks the energy to carry. But Prismo is persistent in ways that respect Simon's agency while still applying gentle pressure. He doesn't frame the request as adventure or purpose or any of the traditional hooks that Simon has learned to tune out. Instead, Prismo presents it as a simple favour between friends, something Simon could help with if he happened to feel like it. No pressure, no expectations. This approach is more effective than anything more direct would be, because it doesn't require Simon to pretend to care about his own continued existence. When Simon finally drags himself to the time room, more out of passive compliance than genuine interest, he encounters Fionna and Cake for the first time. The meeting is awkward in the way that introductions often are when one party is actively suicidal and the other is running from cosmic law enforcement. Simon sees in Fionna someone experiencing a different flavour of the same existential displacement he knows so intimately. She's been torn from context, forced to exist in circumstances that don't fit her nature, struggling to construct meaning from the wreckage of a life that was never quite real to begin with. Fionna sees in Simon a cautionary tale, a vision of what she might become if she allows her depression to run its full course. He's decades ahead of her on the trajectory of giving up, and the destination looks bleak. But there's also something almost comforting about Simon's presence, the recognition that she's not alone in her struggle to find reasons to continue existing. Misery doesn't exactly love company, but it finds a certain validation in company that understands the specific texture of its misery. Prismo's proposal is characteristically indirect, but ultimately straightforward. Simon knows the multiverse, understands its rules and dangers in ways that Fionna and Cake don't. He's travelled through dimensions as the Ice King retained enough memories from that time to serve as guide. Meanwhile, Fionna and Cake need to stay mobile to avoid the Scarab, need someone who can help them navigate between worlds. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, assuming you consider staying alive and avoiding cosmic law enforcement to be benefits, which Simon isn't entirely sure he does. The psychology of agreeing to help when you don't want to help yourself is complex. Simon isn't signing up because he cares about Fionna and Cake's survival. He's signing up because saying no requires more energy than saying yes, because going along with Prismo's plan is easier than articulating why he shouldn't, because on some level he recognizes that this might be his last chance to do something that isn't simply waiting to die. It's not hope exactly, but it's adjacent to hope. close enough that it might serve as a substitute. They begin their journey through the multiverse, with Simon as reluctant guide, Fionna as uncertain hero, and Cake as the only one of them who actually seems to want to be doing this. Their first destination is a training universe, a pocket dimension designed for controlled danger, where Fionna can remember how to fight without the risk of actual death. Simon instructs with the detached competence of someone who no longer has expectations about outcomes. Cake participates with enthusiasm, transforming into various opponents and obstacles. Days pass in the training dimension, and Fionna improves not dramatically, but measurably. She's learning to trust her body's knowledge, even when her mind doubts. Learning to act in combat rather than overthink. Learning that survival doesn't require heroic certainty, just functional competence and willingness to keep moving. Simon finds something resembling purpose in the teaching, a distraction from the constant internal monologue of grief and self-recrimination. Cake is simply having fun, treating training as play. But the training can't last forever. The Scarab is closing in, its tracking protocols adapting to their evasion patterns. They need to move to keep ahead of the pursuit, while Simon guides them toward a solution he's only half formed in his mind. They step through a portal into the next universe, and the multiverse opens before them, infinite and dangerous and indifferent to their survival. They'll navigate it together, or they'll fail together, and either outcome beats dying alone. They travel through universes in rapid succession, each reality offering new dangers and new insights into the nature of existence across dimensions. Farmworld arrives like a punch to Simon's psyche, a universe where he made the right choice, where he rejected the ice crown and died human and sane. This is the reality created by Prismo's wish-granting, brought into being by Finn, the human's desire to prevent the Mushroom War, and the consequences ripple through every aspect of this world. Finn Mertens is not Finn the human, not the heroic adventurer that exists in the primary timeline. This Finn is a farmer, husband, and father, living a mundane existence in a world that never experienced the magical transformation that defined the land of U. He carries himself with the heaviness of someone who has inherited trauma, without inheriting the context to understand it, someone shaped by apocalyptic history, without access to the adventures that might have given that history meaning. The meeting between Fionna and Farmworld Finn is strange for both of them. They're alternate versions of similar archetypes, heroes who were supposed to be heroes, but ended up as something else instead. Fionna sees in Finn a mirror of her own displacement, someone living in the shadow of what might have been, trying to construct meaning from ordinary life while carrying the genetic memory of extraordinary potential. Finn sees in Fionna something he can't quite name, a reminder of paths not taken, of versions of himself that exist in other realities doing the heroic things he sometimes dreams about. Finn's farm is maintained with the obsessive precision of someone trying to create order in a chaotic universe. Everything has its place. Every tool is properly stored. Every animal is cared for according to rigid schedules. This order is not peaceful, it's defensive, a bulwark against the chaos that Finn knows lurks beneath reality's surface, even if he can't consciously articulate why he knows this. His wife notices his obsessiveness, but attributes it to farm life's demands, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of inherited trauma he has no framework to process. The psychological concept of inherited trauma becomes literal in the multiverse. Finn Mertens carries the weight of decisions made by other versions of himself in other timelines, carries the consequences of wishes and choices that technically aren't his but still shape his reality. He has dreams of being a hero, of fighting monsters and saving princesses, but he dismisses these as fantasies, childish imaginings, that have no place in his adult life of responsibility and routine. He doesn't know that these dreams are memories of other hymns, echoes of heroic timelines bleeding through into his mundane existence. Simon avoids Finn as much as possible, unable to bear the reminder of what this universe represents. In Farmworld, Simon's choice to reject the Ice Crown is vindicated, proven right by the fact that the world survived without magical corruption. But that rightness comes at the cost of everything Simon actually experienced, the 1,000 years of Ice King existence that, however twisted, were still existence. Simon is confronting the ultimate doubt of the depressed person. Would it have been better if I had never survived at all? Farmworld suggests the answer might be yes, and Simon doesn't know how to process that. The real danger reveals itself when they discover evidence of the Ice Crown's presence in this universe. Despite Simon's choice to reject it in the timeline that created Farmworld, the crown still exists, still calls to those susceptible to its corruption, still represents the possibility of magic breaking through into a world that was supposed to remain mundane. And Finn's son has found it, picked it up, brought it home like an interesting artifact without understanding what it is or what it can do. This discovery triggers immediate crisis for everyone. Simon knows exactly what the crown means, understands the danger it represents better than anyone. He went through centuries of corruption, lost himself completely to its influence, and now he's confronting the possibility of watching someone else, a child, make the same mistake. But Simon also feels the crown's pull, even now, even after everything. The seductive promise of power, of purpose, of escape from human grief into magical madness. Simon makes a choice that surprises everyone, including himself. Instead of reaching for the crown or simply explaining its dangers to Finn, he asks to destroy it. Not put it away safely, not lock it up somewhere, but actually destroy it, end its existence in this universe so it can't corrupt anyone else the way it corrupted him. This is the first proactive choice Simon has made since losing Betty. The first time he's chosen to act rather than simply react or refuse to act at all. The crown's destruction becomes a group effort, all of them combining their abilities to overcome the artifact's resistance. Cake wraps around it, containing its energy. Simon provides expertise on its weaknesses, knowledge gained through centuries of fusion with the thing. Fionna contributes raw determination, the stubborn refusal to let this object cause more harm. And Finn, still not fully understanding, but recognizing genuine danger when he sees it, adds his strength to the effort. The moment of destruction is not satisfying or cathartic. The crown shatters, its fragments dissolving into non-existence, and everyone feels the absence where its dark promise used to be. But there's no sense of victory, no relief. They've prevented one corruption in one universe, but the multiverse contains infinite ice crowns, infinite opportunities for that particular tragedy to repeat. They can't save everyone, can't fix everything. They can only address the immediate crisis in front of them and move on to the next universe. They leave Farmworld without ceremony, slipping through a portal while Finn's family is still processing what happened. Fionna feels guilty about the disruption they caused, about the seeds of discontent planted in those children's minds. But Simon reminds her, with grim pragmatism, that their presence always causes disruption, that fugitives can't afford to stay anywhere long enough to clean up their messes, that survival sometimes means leaving damage in your wake. The next universe they enter is beautiful in the way that nightmares can be beautiful, everything crystalline and perfect and utterly, completely wrong. This is the Winter Kingdom, a reality where the Ice Crown claimed Marceline instead of Simon, where the Vampire Queen's immortal existence became fused with the Crown's corrupting magic, where love and madness merged into something that defies easy categorization. The snow falls in patterns too regular to be natural. The ice formations reflect light at angles that shouldn't be possible, and the castle that dominates the landscape is simultaneously magnificent and deeply, profoundly unsettling. Simon recognizes this universe immediately, and the recognition is worse than Farmworld was, worse than anything they've encountered so far. This is a universe where Marceline, his Marceline, the child he saved and protected and loved like a daughter, became what he became, wore the crown, lost herself to madness, spent centuries corrupted by magic that twisted her nature into something monstrous. Simon can barely process this, can barely remain standing under the weight of seeing the cost of his salvation transferred to someone else. Ice Marcy rules the Winter Kingdom with the obsessive focus that characterizes all Ice Crown bearers. Her kingdom is perfect, maintained with magical precision, every snowflake placed deliberately, every ice sculpture reflecting her vision of ideal beauty. But perfection requires control, and control requires vigilance, and vigilance has consumed Ice Marcy entirely. She is the crown, and the crown is her, boundaries dissolved through centuries of fusion, neither quite separate anymore. Her obsession centers on Princess Bubblegum, who in this universe remains uncorrupted and terrified, kept in Ice Marcy's castle as the focus of a love that has curdled into possession. This is what the Ice Crown does to love, transforms it into something that justifies any action, any violation, any horror in the name of keeping the beloved close. Ice Marcy believes, with the unshakable conviction of madness, that she is protecting Bubblegum, caring for her, giving her the safety and perfection that she deserves. Fionna's encounter with Ice Marcy is psychologically complicated. She sees in Ice Marcy a version of what she might have become if circumstances had been slightly different, if she'd found the Ice Crown instead of living in mundane depression. Ice Marcy is powerful, purposeful, absolutely certain of her actions and their righteousness. She has no existential doubt, no depression, no questioning of her own reality or significance. She simply is, utterly and completely herself, even if that self is twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. The horror of Ice Marcy isn't her cruelty, though she is capable of terrible things. It's her conviction, her absolute certainty that what she's doing is loving and good and necessary. She has rationalized her actions so thoroughly that contradiction doesn't penetrate. When Fionna questions whether Bubblegum actually wants to be in the castle, Ice Marcy responds with the patient condescension of someone explaining obvious truths to a child. Of course, Bubblegum wants to be here. She's safe here, protected, loved. What else could anyone possibly want? Princess Bubblegum, trapped in this beautiful nightmare, has developed psychological survival mechanisms that make her simultaneously sympathetic and deeply tragic. She has learned to play along with Ice Marcy's delusions to the extent necessary to maintain some small degree of safety, has become an expert at managing her captor's moods and expectations, has constructed a false self that can interact with Ice Marcy while her true self remains hidden and protected in whatever small psychological space she can maintain. Fionna connects with Bubblegum through the bars of her crystalline prison, recognizing in the princess someone who, like herself, has learned to exist in a state of profound disconnection from their own desires and needs. Bubblegum wants to escape, but has almost forgotten what escape would mean, has been imprisoned so long that freedom has become abstract, theoretical, something she can imagine but can't quite believe in. Fionna understands this completely, recognizes the psychology of depression and imprisonment as nearly identical. The escape attempt they organize is less heroic action and more desperate improvisation. Fionna doesn't have a plan so much as a series of intuitive responses to immediate obstacles. Cake provides support, her shape-shifting abilities, allowing them to access areas that should be impossible to reach. And Simon, despite his paralysis in Ice Marcy's presence, contributes crucial knowledge about how the Ice Crown works, where its wielder's attention must focus, what gaps exist in even magically maintained perfect control. The confrontation between Simon and Ice Marcy becomes inevitable when Simon physically places himself between Ice Marcy and the escaping bubblegum. For the first time since they arrived in this universe, Simon manages to speak, and what he says is simple and devastating. This isn't love. This is what the crown does to love. Ice Marcy responds with confusion rather than anger, genuinely unable to process the accusation. Of course this is love. What else could it possibly be? But something in Simon's voice, some recognition of shared experience with the crown, briefly penetrates Ice Marcy's certainty. She hesitates, and in that hesitation, Fionna and Cake get bubblegum through a portal to somewhere else, anywhere else, a reality where she has a chance to recover from centuries of beautiful imprisonment. The escape succeeds not through heroic battle, but through the momentary crack in Ice Marcy's absolute conviction, the brief space where doubt exists before certainty reasserts itself. Simon is broken by the experience in new ways, forced to confront what he was in the primary timeline, how many people he hurt and traumatized and imprisoned in his own delusional pursuit of princesses. He sees Ice Marcy and recognizes himself, and that recognition is unendurable. This is what Betty saw when she looked at the Ice King. This is what Marceline endured for centuries while trying to hold on to whatever fragments of Simon remained accessible. They leave the Winter Kingdom through a portal, aware that Ice Marcy is too powerful to fight directly, but also too trapped in her delusion to pursue them. The universe they emerge into next is deliberately chosen by Simon to be as mundane and non-magical as possible, a reality where they can rest without confronting any more twisted versions of people they know or could have become. They need time to process, to recover, to figure out how to continue after witnessing something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of love and care. But rest doesn't last long when you're fugitives from cosmic law. The Scarab has been learning, adapting its pursuit strategies based on their evasion patterns, and it arrives in this mundane reality with frightening efficiency. The psychology of being hunted by something that learns is different from being hunted by something merely relentless. The Scarab isn't just following them anymore, it's predicting them, anticipating their choices, closing off escape routes before Fionna and Cake recognize those routes as options. Fionna's depression, which has been gradually lifting through the intensity of their adventures, threatens to return when she realizes they can't keep running forever. But something has changed in Fionna since they started this journey. She's fought in Farmworld, rescued Bubblegum from the Winter Kingdom, survived encounter after encounter with realities that want to destroy or corrupt or imprison her. She's not the same depressed barista who could barely drag herself through ordinary days. This engagement manifests as strategy. Instead of simply fleeing when the Scarab appears, Fionna starts thinking about its patterns, its limitations, the ways it approaches pursuit. It's methodical and efficient, which means it's also predictable. It follows protocols, which means those protocols can potentially be exploited. Simon contributes crucial insights about cosmic bureaucracies and their limitations, drawing on his centuries of navigating magical realms. The plan they develop is desperate and probably doomed, but it's something more than just running. They're going to force the Scarab into a situation where its pursuit protocols conflict with higher priority cosmic laws. Specifically, they're going to find a universe that's under protected status, where any dimensional incursion, including Scarab pursuit, would violate treaties that predate the Scarab's existence. If they can reach such a universe and force the Scarab to follow them there, they might trigger intervention from even higher cosmic authorities. Finding a protected universe requires information that exists in cosmic archives. Simon remembers from his Ice King years a network of dimensional librarians who catalogue realities and their legal status. Getting access to these librarians requires bargaining and persuasion, but it's their best option. The journey to the librarian's archive takes them through 3 unstable universes in quick succession, realities that are collapsing or merging or experiencing dimensional turbulence. Negotiating with the librarians reveals interesting aspects of Simon's character that have been hidden underneath his depression. He's charming when he needs to be, erudite and respectful, and capable of intellectual discourse that matches the librarian's own academic standards. The Ice King's social incompetence wasn't Simon's natural state, it was a product of the Crown's corruption. Simon, when focused and motivated by something other than his own grief, is actually quite socially capable. The information they purchase identifies Reality 08, a universe under Category 5 protection, because it's undergoing critical developmental phase that must not be interfered with by external dimensional forces. Any incursion, including pursuit by cosmic law enforcement, would violate treaties established by the oldest entities in the multiverse. They need to get there and force the Scarab to follow, triggering intervention that might finally get the Scarab off their trail. But getting to Reality 08 requires passing through intermediate universes, each more dangerous than the last, and the Scarab is closing the distance with every jump they make. The first universe is one of constant warfare, realities at different tech levels, fighting for dominance. They navigate through combat zones, avoiding entanglement, focused only on reaching the next portal. The second universe is worse, a reality where physics itself is inconsistent, where gravity and time and causality shift unpredictably. The third universe is personal nightmare territory for Simon, a reality identical to his home universe, except Betty never existed, was never born, was erased from history by some causal anomaly. Simon experiences this universe like walking through his own life with everything he loved surgically removed. Fionna watches Simon nearly break under the weight of this universe, sees him considering just staying here. But Cake won't let him give up, physically dragging him toward the portal when he stops moving. They reach Reality 08 just ahead of the Scarab, tumbling through the portal into a universe that feels immediately profoundly different from anything they've experienced. This is a universe at a critical developmental juncture, where sentient life is just emerging, where the choices made in the next cosmic moments will determine the entire future trajectory of reality. It's beautiful and fragile and absolutely protected by forces that make the Scarab look trivial by comparison. The Scarab arrives seconds later, following its pursuit protocols with mechanical inevitability. And the moment it enters Reality 08, alarms sound across multiple dimensions. Cosmic authorities that have been asleep for eons, suddenly awake and angry. The Scarab has violated Category 5 protection, has transgressed laws that predate its own existence, and the consequences manifest immediately. What happens next is beyond comprehension. Entities that exist at scales larger than universes arrive to address the violation. The Scarab, for the first time since it began pursuing Fionna and Cake, experiences something like fear. It attempts to explain, to justify its presence, based on pursuit of unauthorized dimensional travelers. But the cosmic authorities don't care about its excuses. Protected reality is protected reality, and violation carries consequences regardless of motivation. Fionna, Cake, and Simon watch as the Scarab is judged by forces that make it look small and powerless. The judgment is swift and absolute. The Scarab is recalled, its pursuit contract terminated, its protocols rewritten to prevent future violations of protected realities. Fionna and Cake's case is transferred to different authorities, ones who are too busy managing cosmic scale concerns to care about two relatively harmless dimensional travelers. The moment of relief is overwhelming. They're not free exactly, but they're free from the Scarab, free from that particular pursuit, free from the mechanical inevitability of that specific ending. Fionna cries, months of accumulated stress releasing in great heaving sobs. Cake wraps around her, providing comfort and warmth. Simon sits and stares at nothing, processing the fact that they survived, that his plan worked, that maybe he's not completely useless after all. Reality 08 is peaceful around them, continuing its critical development without noticing the tiny drama that just played out on its edges. They can't stay here long. The protection that saved them also means they're not supposed to be here at all. But they have time to breathe, time to rest, time to acknowledge that they've overcome something that seemed insurmountable. And in that moment of rest, all three of them realize that they've become something more than desperate fugitives. They've become a team, maybe even friends, bound together by shared trauma and shared survival. Returning to the time room feels different this time. When Fionna and Cake first stumbled into Prismo's domain, they were desperate fugitives with no plan and no hope. Now they return as seasoned travelers, still unauthorized, but no longer helpless, having survived the Scarab and the multiverse and their own psychological limitations. Prismo greets them with his characteristic casual warmth, but there's tension in his demeanor that suggests the situation has become more complicated. The cosmic authorities who terminated the Scarab's pursuit haven't forgotten about Fionna and Cake. They've simply relegated the case to lower priority, which means eventually someone will get around to addressing it, and when they do, the consequences could be worse than anything the Scarab threatened. Prismo has been working on a solution, using his considerable influence and his access to cosmic bureaucracies, but solutions always come with costs. The psychology of accepting help when you know it comes with prices you can't fully pay is its own kind of torture. Fionna wants to be legal, wants to stop running, wants to build something resembling a stable existence. But she's also aware that she has nothing to offer in trade, no resources or abilities that could compensate Prismo for whatever he's about to sacrifice on their behalf. This creates a debt that can't be repaid, a burden of obligation that will define her relationship with Prismo forever. Prismo explains the situation with his usual mixture of humour and honesty. He can petition for Fionna and Cake to be granted refugee status, recognised as displaced beings who deserve protection rather than punishment. But doing this requires him to call in favours, to spend political capital he's been accumulating over eons, to potentially compromise his own position within cosmic bureaucracies. It's not a small ask, and Prismo isn't pretending it is. Simon asks the question that Fionna is too overwhelmed to articulate. Why would Prismo do this? What does he gain from helping them? The question isn't accusatory, it's genuinely curious, an attempt to understand the motivations of a cosmic entity whose goals and needs are so far beyond human comprehension. Prismo's answer is characteristically indirect, but ultimately simple. He's lonely. Most of his visitors see him as a tool, a means to an end. Fionna, Cake, and Simon are different. They've become something approaching friends. This revelation shifts the dynamic entirely. Fionna has been approaching this as a transaction, preparing herself for the burden of debt and obligation. But Prismo is reframing it as reciprocal care, as beings who matter to each other, helping each other, because that's what mattering means. It's not transactional, it's relational, which makes it more genuine, but also somehow more weighty. You can eventually repay a debt, but you can never fully repay someone for caring about your existence. The process of petitioning for refugee status involves Prismo calling in entities that make even his cosmic perspective look limited. These are beings who manage the fundamental architecture of the multiverse, who write the laws that other cosmic authorities enforce. They arrive in forms that hurt to perceive directly, and they communicate through concepts that bypass language entirely, implanting meaning directly into consciousness. Fionna experiences this communication as overwhelming, her mind struggling to process information that wasn't designed for human comprehension. She understands that she and Cake are being evaluated, their existence measured against criteria that she can't fully grasp. The entities are not hostile, but they're not particularly compassionate either. They're administrative, processing her case with the same emotional investment that a mundane bureaucrat might process a parking violation. Simon finds himself unexpectedly advocating for Fionna and Cake, using his knowledge of magical law and cosmic protocols to frame arguments that the entities might find persuasive. He's not doing this out of obligation or even friendship exactly, but out of recognition that this is something he can do, a way his accumulated knowledge can be useful. It's the first time since losing Betty that Simon has felt competent, has used his expertise to achieve something tangible and immediate. The entities deliberate in ways that exist outside normal time, so from Fionna's perspective, the judgment is both instantaneous and eternal. When they finally render their decision, it's communicated through Prismo, who translates cosmic administrative language into something approaching human comprehensibility. The answer is yes, but with conditions, and the conditions are specific to each of them. Fionna's condition is that she must accept her existence as fundamentally ambiguous. The cosmic authorities cannot determine whether she was created by the Ice King's magic, or whether she existed independently and was merely documented by his fanfiction. This ambiguity is permanent, unresolvable, and she must learn to build an identity that doesn't depend on resolving it. It's not a punishment, exactly, but it's a recognition that some questions don't have answers, and psychological health sometimes means accepting that uncertainty. Cake's condition is simpler. She must acknowledge that her magic is not naturally occurring, but rather a dimensional anomaly, a glitch in reality that has been retroactively legitimized through this refugee status. This means her powers could theoretically be revoked if she violates dimensional travel protocols, which creates a different kind of obligation. Cake must be responsible with abilities that were never supposed to exist. Simon's condition is unexpected and reveals that the cosmic entities have been paying more attention than anyone realized. He's not being granted refugee status because he doesn't need it. He's already a legitimate resident of his home universe. But his involvement with Fionna and Cake has created a bond that the entities recognize as significant. Simon's condition is that he must continue living, must commit to his own survival for a period of no less than 10 years, must not pursue death, either actively or through passive neglect. This condition is simultaneously merciful and cruel. The entities are recognizing Simon's suicidal ideation and are constraining it, forcing him to choose life not because he wants to, but because refusing would nullify Fionna and Cake's refugee status. It creates accountability, makes Simon's continued existence matter to someone other than himself, which is both therapeutic and manipulative. Simon is being used as leverage against his own self-destructive impulses. Accepting these conditions feels like surrendering something fundamental, like agreeing to constraints that will define the rest of their existences. But the alternative is continued flight, continued illegality, continued risk of cosmic enforcement that might not be as lenient as the Scarab was. Fionna, Cake, and Simon agree to the conditions, not enthusiastically, but with the grim pragmatism of beings who understand that perfect solutions don't exist. Prismo finalizes the arrangement, invoking powers and authorities that make the time room shimmer with cosmic significance. The refugee status becomes official, recorded in whatever databases cosmic bureaucracies maintain. Fionna and Cake are now legal, their existence authorized, their right to travel recognized within specific parameters. The relief should be overwhelming, but instead it's muted, complicated by the conditions and the costs and the recognition of what Prismo sacrificed to make this happen. Prismo seems diminished somehow, as if calling in all those favours and spending all that political capital has cost him something essential. He maintains his casual demeanour, makes jokes about the whole process, acts like this was no big deal. But Fionna can see the exhaustion underneath, can recognise the signs of someone who has given more than they could comfortably afford because they cared about the outcome. The time room becomes their sanctuary in a new way. It's not just a cosmic rest stop anymore, it's the home of someone who matters to them, someone who has demonstrated care through sacrifice rather than just through words. They owe Prismo something that can't be quantified or repaid, and that debt creates a bond that's deeper than simple friendship. Prismo offers them continued access to the time room, a place to return to between adventures, a home base in the multiverse. They spend time in the time room, recovering from the intensity of the cosmic judgment, processing what it means to be legal after so long as fugitives. The psychological shift is disorienting, removing the adrenaline and urgency that has been defining their existence, leaving them with the question of what they do now. They're authorized to travel, but where do they go? They're safe, but what do they do with that safety? Simon is struggling most visibly with his condition, with the obligation to live that has been imposed on him. 10 years feels like an eternity when each day is already difficult to survive. But there's also something almost liberating about having the choice removed, about being forced to engage with life, because refusing would hurt Fionna and Cake. It creates external motivation where internal motivation has failed, and while that's not ideal, it's functional. Fionna finds herself thinking about the mundane world she escaped from, wondering if she could return now, if she'd want to. She has legal status, could theoretically build a life anywhere in the multiverse that accepts dimensional travellers. But which universe would that be? What life would she build? The questions are overwhelming in their openness. The burden of infinite possibility, somehow heavier than the constraints of fugitive existence. The decision to return to her mundane world surprises Fionna as much as it surprises Cake and Simon. After everything they've been through, the idea of going back to the boring, magicless reality where she served coffee and struggled to pay rent seems absurd. But Fionna needs to see it again, needs to understand what she escaped from and whether that escape was towards something or just away from something. There's a difference, and the difference matters. The world hasn't changed in the time she's been gone. The same streets, the same coffee shop, the same apartment building. Everything is mundane and normal, and exactly as depressing as Fionna remembers, except now she has context for comparison. She knows what magical realities look like, knows what adventure feels like, knows what it's like to matter in immediate, tangible ways, rather than just existing as a cog in someone else's economic machine. Her former boss doesn't recognize her at first. Fionna has changed in ways that go beyond physical appearance, carries herself differently, moves through space with confidence that wasn't there before. When recognition finally clicks, the boss's response is purely transactional. Did Fionna intend to return to work, or should the job be posted as available? No anger about her disappearance, no curiosity about where she went, just administrative processing of her absence. Walking through the apartment she shared with Cake is strange, like visiting a museum of her former depression. Everything is preserved exactly as they left it. Posters of adventures on the walls, weapons that were once just decorative, now recognizable as actual functional tools. The space is smaller than she remembers, more cramped, the physical manifestation of how constrained her life was before Cake's transformation forced them into the multiverse. Simon refuses to enter the apartment, stays outside in the hallway, processing his own complicated feelings about mundane realities. This is similar to the world he lived in after losing Betty, before Prismo recruited him for the multiverse journey. He recognizes the particular quality of depression that permeates this place, the sense of lives being endured rather than lived. It's uncomfortably familiar, and Simon has no desire to immerse himself in that familiarity. The decision to give up the apartment happens gradually over several hours. Fionna goes through her possessions, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. Most of it feels like it belongs to someone else, artifacts of a person she used to be but can't quite recognize anymore. She keeps photographs and a few meaningful objects, leaves behind most of the mundane accumulation that defined her former life. The coffee shop visit is brief and uncomfortable. Fionna goes in during her former shift time, observes the new person doing her old job with the same mechanical efficiency she once performed. The customers are the same types, ordering the same drinks, treating service workers with the same mixture of indifference and entitlement. Fionna watches this and feels simultaneously grateful to have escaped and guilty about that gratitude. One former co-worker asks where she's been, with casual curiosity that doesn't actually care about the answer. Fionna struggles to respond, settling on a vague explanation about travelling, about needing a change. The co-worker nods with polite disinterest, already moving on mentally. It's a perfectly mundane interaction that would have devastated Fionna in her former state, but now just feels hollow. They gather in a park near the apartment, three-dimensional travellers taking a break in a world that doesn't know what dimensional travel is. The conversation turns philosophical. Fionna asks Simon if he thinks mundane life is inherently depressing, or if depression makes mundane life seem worse than it actually is. Simon considers seriously, drawing on his experiences both as depressed human and as magically corrupted Ice King. His answer is nuanced. Mundane life requires certain psychological capacities to find meaningful, and depression strips those capacities away, creating a feedback loop where the depression makes life seem unbearable, and the unbearable life reinforces the depression. Cake offers her perspective, characteristically direct. She was bored as a regular cat, but she wasn't depressed because cats don't have the kind of self-reflective consciousness that enables depression. Fionna realizes through this conversation that her depression wasn't caused by mundane life. Exactly, but rather mundane life without purpose or connection or hope for change. The coffee job wasn't inherently unbearable. It was unbearable combined with the certainty that this was all her life would ever be. The multiverse adventures haven't cured her depression, but they've introduced variables that make continued existence feel less predetermined. They return to the time room without ceremony, stepping through a portal while the mundane world continues without noticing their departure. Prismo is waiting with questions about how the visit went. Fionna struggles to articulate what she learned, settling eventually on this: she's glad she left, and she's glad she went back, and she's glad she left again. The mundane world was exactly as she remembered, which means the problem wasn't primarily the world, it was her inability to function within it, and that inability has started to change. Fionna makes a decision. Sitting in the time room, surrounded by the two beings who have become her family, she's going to consider herself real, going to choose to believe that her existence is genuine, even without definitive proof. The cosmic entities couldn't determine her origins, made that uncertainty a condition of her refugee status, which means she has to decide for herself what her ambiguous existence means, and she decides it means she's real enough. This decision is not dramatic or complete. Fionna will continue to have doubts, will continue to wonder about her origins, but she's choosing a different relationship to those doubts, treating them as interesting questions rather than existential crises. She exists, she has experiences, she matters to Cake and Simon and Prismo, and that's enough foundation to build an identity on, even if the foundation's origins remain ambiguous. The signal arrives in the time room like a whisper across infinite distance, a message that shouldn't be possible but is happening anyway. Someone is trying to contact Simon, and that someone is doing it through channels that exist outside normal dimensional communication. Prismo recognizes the signature immediately. This is GOLB's energy, or what GOLB's energy has become since fusing with Betty Groff, attempting communication in ways that violate several fundamental cosmic protocols. Simon's response is complex and immediate. Terror that this might be real. Hope that Betty has found some way to reach him. Resentment that he's being pulled back into grief just when he was starting to develop coping mechanisms. He's been living with the obligation to survive, has been slowly, painfully accepting that Betty is gone in all ways that matter. This message threatens to undo that fragile acceptance. Fionna watches Simon process this information and recognizes the danger immediately. Hope is not always helpful, especially when it's hope for something that might not be possible. But she also understands that love doesn't respond to logic, that Simon will have to engage with this message regardless of whether it's wise or healthy. Cake is more straightforward in her concern, worried about watching Simon get hurt again. Prismo establishes the connection with extreme caution, building safeguards that will protect the time room and its inhabitants from potential cosmic contamination. GOLB is not a safe entity to communicate with, and even fused with Betty's consciousness, it represents forces that could accidentally destroy anyone who makes direct contact. The communication channel Prismo creates is filtered through multiple layers of reality. The voice that comes through is not quite Betty's, but it's close enough to make Simon's breath catch. It's Betty's patterns of speech, filtered through cosmic vastness, her personality barely recognizable, underneath the transformation that fused her with a chaos god. She remembers him, knows who he is, retains enough of her human consciousness to want to communicate, even though communication requires immense effort across impossible distance. GOLBetty's message is not the reunion Simon might have hoped for. She's not returning, can't return. Her fusion with Golb is permanent and irreversible. But she's found a way to maintain some degree of individual consciousness within that fusion, has carved out a space where Betty exists, even while being fundamentally integrated into something vastly larger than herself. She wanted Simon to know this, wanted him to understand that her sacrifice wasn't the complete obliteration of her existence. The psychological complexity of receiving this message is almost unbearable. Simon should be relieved that Betty isn't entirely gone, that some aspect of her consciousness persists. But the message also confirms that she can never return, that this distant, mediated communication is the only form their relationship can take now. It's simultaneously better than he feared and worse than he hoped. GOLBetty explains that she's been watching Simon, has witnessed his journey through the multiverse and his slow acceptance of her loss. She's proud of him for surviving, for choosing to continue existing, even when existence felt unbearable. She understands that her sacrifice hurt him in ways she couldn't fully anticipate when she made the choice. And she's sorry for that pain, even while standing by the necessity of her decision. This apology breaks something in Simon, releases grief that has been held in place by anger and resentment. He's been angry at Betty for sacrificing herself without asking his permission, for choosing to save him when he would have preferred to remain cursed if it meant she could remain herself. But hearing her acknowledge his pain, while also maintaining that her choice was necessary, gives Simon permission to hold both truths simultaneously. GOLBetty has a request, delivered with hesitation. She wants Simon to let her go, not in the sense of forgetting her, but in the sense of releasing his hope for reunion. She needs him to accept that this communication is the closest they'll ever get to being together again, that his continued survival requires him to build a life that doesn't center on waiting for her return. She's asking him to move on, and the request is simultaneously loving and devastating. Simon's response is not immediate. He sits with the request, processes what it means to let go of the person who defined most of his adult existence. The 10-year survival obligation was external motivation. This is different. This is Betty asking him to choose life not as obligation but as genuine choice, to want to survive rather than just agreeing to survive. The conversation that follows is the most honest Simon has been with anyone since losing Betty. He admits that he doesn't know how to want to live, that existence feels like burden rather than gift, that he continues mainly through momentum and obligation rather than genuine investment in his own future. He admits that he's angry at her for leaving, angry at himself for needing saving, angry at the universe for creating circumstances where such impossible choices became necessary. GOLBetty receives this honesty with compassion filtered through cosmic vastness. She acknowledges that she can't make his grief easier, can't provide the kind of comfort that requires physical presence and ordinary human interaction. But she can offer permission, can release him from whatever obligation he feels to her memory, can explicitly state that she wants him to find happiness, even if that happiness doesn't include her. This permission is what Simon needed without knowing he needed it. He's been holding on to his grief, partially because grief felt like loyalty, because moving on felt like betrayal of Betty's sacrifice. Having Betty herself release him from that loyalty creates space for a different relationship with his continued existence. He can grieve her and also build a new life. He can honor her sacrifice by actually living rather than just existing. The communication is draining for GOLBetty, requiring resources and attention that she can't sustain for long. She prepares to end the connection, to return fully to her cosmic responsibilities. But before disconnecting, she acknowledges Fionna and Cake, thanks them for becoming Simon's family when she couldn't be, validates their importance in his continued survival. The disconnection is gradual, GOLBetty's presence fading from the communication channel like a sunset happening too fast. Simon feels the loss immediately, a fresh wound on top of old wounds. But this time, the loss comes with context, with permission, with understanding that makes it marginally more bearable. Betty is gone, but also not entirely gone, exists in a state that defies normal categories of present or absent. Hours pass in silence, the time room existing outside normal time. Eventually, Simon speaks, says the thing that has become true through GOLBetty's intervention. He doesn't want to die. Not enthusiastically, not with joy or confidence about the future, but genuinely. He wants to survive, wants to discover what kind of life he can build now that he's released from the obligation to wait for Betty's return. Fionna recognizes this shift and understands its importance. Watching Simon choose life after receiving permission from the person he lost gives Fionna perspective on her own situation. She doesn't need definitive answers about her origins to decide that existing is worthwhile, doesn't need external validation to choose engagement with her own life. Simon makes a commitment to Fionna and Cake, extending the obligation imposed by cosmic authorities into genuine promise. He'll stay alive not just for 10 years, but for as long as his existence continues naturally, will engage with life rather than just enduring it, will allow himself to build something new, even though that new thing will never include Betty. The decision to establish a more permanent base happens organically. Prismo's domain has become the default location they portal back to, but the time room is Prismo's space. Fionna articulates the need first, asking whether there's somewhere in the multiverse they could establish as actual home. The question surprises Simon and Cake, because neither had quite reached the point of thinking that far ahead. The psychology of creating home after extended displacement is complicated. Home requires investment in future existence, requires believing that you'll continue long enough to make establishing a base worthwhile. For Simon, this represents massive psychological progress from his initial suicidal state. For Fionna, it's choosing to build something real, even without definitive answers about whether she herself is real. For Cake, it's simply exciting. Prismo takes the request seriously, recognizing what it represents psychologically. He uses his cosmic connections to identify potential locations. They settle eventually on a pocket dimension that exists adjacent to multiple universes, a dimensional crossroads that's been mostly ignored by cosmic authorities. The dimension is nearly empty when they first arrive, a blank canvas of stable reality waiting to be shaped. Simon approaches the project with unexpected enthusiasm, drawing on his academic background to design structures that respect both practical needs and aesthetic considerations. He hasn't had a project to invest in since losing Betty, hasn't felt capable of future-oriented planning when his own future felt terminally uncertain. But designing a home engages parts of his mind that have been dormant. Fionna discovers unexpected joy in the physical labour of building, using her developing heroic capabilities to accomplish construction tasks. She can lift massive weights, can work for hours without exhaustion. It's deeply satisfying work, creating something tangible and permanent from her efforts. Cake contributes by shape-shifting into various tools as needed, becoming a ladder, a hammer, a measuring instrument. The home that emerges reflects all three of their influences. Simon's academic precision in the overall design, Fionna's preference for functional simplicity, Cake's playful touches in decorative elements. They create separate spaces for each of them, recognizing that family requires both togetherness and autonomy. Simon's space is library-like, Fionna's is sparse and flexible, Cake's is elaborately cat-optimized. The communal areas become the heart of their home, spaces designed for shared meals and conversations. They establish routines, rhythms of daily existence that provide structure. Simon introduces intellectual discussions. Fionna contributes training routines. Cake introduces play and activities that serve no purpose beyond creating positive shared experiences. The dimension slowly develops ecosystem and character through their presence. Plants begin growing, drawn from other universes. Small creatures arrive, dimensional fauna that find their way through the pathways. Weather patterns emerge, influenced by their collective preferences. Home becomes not just structure, but living environment. Months pass in this new stability, and all three of them change in subtle ways. Simon is still grieving Betty, but the grief has become integrated rather than consuming. He's developing new interests, new relationships, with ideas that don't connect back to Betty. Fionna is more confident, her self-doubt still present, but no longer paralyzing. She's accepting her ambiguous origins as part of her story rather than as crisis that must be resolved. Cake is thriving in ways that surprise everyone. Having a home base makes her adventures more meaningful because she always has somewhere to return to. The stability doesn't constrain her, it liberates her. They're not healed, any of them. Trauma doesn't disappear just because you build a house and establish routines, but they're functioning, living, rather than just surviving. The home becomes known to other dimensional travelers, a place where refugees and wanderers can stop for rest and advice. Simon, Fionna, and Cake develop reputation as beings who understand displacement and loss. They're not trying to be heroes, but they're willing to help when help is needed and possible. This helping extends their family outward, creates network of connections. The concept of ending doesn't quite apply to lives that continue. Fionna sits in her home dimension, morning light filtering through windows that look out on a garden she planted with Simon's guidance, and thinks about how strange it is to feel something approaching contentment. Not happiness exactly, but contentment, the sense that her life is acceptable, that continued existence is worthwhile. Simon is in his library space, researching dimensional theory that captured his interest. He's focused, engaged, operating with intellectual intensity that used to characterize him. He still grieves Betty, will always grieve her, but the grief has become companion rather than prison. He can think about other things, care about other things, invest in projects that don't connect back to Betty's absence. Cake is somewhere chasing creatures that have colonized their space, engaged in play that serves no purpose beyond her own enjoyment. She's magic incarnate, shape-shifting through forms with joy. She's also deeply committed to Fionna and Simon, returns regularly to check on them, to ensure they're eating and sleeping and not disappearing into overthinking. Fionna's thoughts turn philosophical, processing how far she's come from the depressed barista. She still doesn't know definitively whether she was created by the Ice King's magic or whether she existed independently. The cosmic authorities couldn't determine her origins, and that ambiguity is permanent. But the question feels less urgent than it used to, less like existential crisis and more like interesting uncertainty she can live with. The multiverse continues its chaotic evolution around their small home dimension. Realities are born and collapse, beings travel between universes, cosmic authorities maintain whatever order is possible. Fionna, Simon, and Cake are tiny parts of this vast system, but they're real parts, authorized parts, beings who have earned their place through survival and adaptation. Adventures still happen because dimensional travelers encounter adventures whether they seek them or not. But the adventures have different quality now, less desperate flight and more genuine exploration. They visit universes because they're curious, because they want to help someone, because there's something interesting to learn. They return home when they're tired or hurt, or just want to be in familiar space. The relationship between the three of them has evolved beyond desperate alliance. They're family now in ways that transcend biology or cosmic destiny. They chose each other repeatedly through circumstances that would have been sufficient excuse to separate. They know each other's damage, have witnessed each other at their worst, and have decided that the connection is worth maintaining. Simon has integrated his obligation to live into genuine preference for living. The 10-year commitment felt like burden initially, but somewhere in the years of building home and family and routine, the constraint became internalized, became actual desire to continue existing. He's not consistently happy, but he's consistently engaged. Fionna has built identity from ambiguous foundation, accepted that she might never know her exact origins, but can still construct meaningful existence from her current experiences. She's a hero not because she was created to be one, but because she chooses heroic action when circumstances require it. She's real, not because she can prove origins, but because she experiences reality and affects reality. Cake has become bridge between Simon's intellectual complexity and Fionna's practical directness. She's not simple exactly, but she's uncomplicated in ways that both Simon and Fionna need. She demonstrates that life can be lived without constantly interrogating every experience for deeper meaning, that sometimes existing and enjoying and moving forward is sufficient response. They receive visitors, occasionally, other dimensional travelers who seek advice or rest. Simon, Fionna, and Cake have become elders of a sort, not through age, but through experience. They share what they've learned freely, offer support without requiring permanent obligation, send travelers back into the multiverse, slightly more equipped to handle whatever they encounter. Prismo remains constant presence in their lives, their visits to the time room regular enough to be routine, but spaced enough to be special. He's their connection to cosmic bureaucracies, their friend who exists at scales they can barely comprehend, their reminder that help sometimes comes from unexpected sources, and that cosmic entities can be lonely and need connection, just like smaller beings do. The dimension itself has become character in their story, shaped by their presence, but also shaping them. It's stable in ways that provide security without becoming stagnant, flexible in ways that allow growth without losing coherence. It's home in the deepest sense, not just physical location, but psychological anchor. Fionna finds herself thinking about the mundane world occasionally, wondering how her former co-workers are doing. She doesn't want to return, but she's no longer angry about the time she spent there, can recognize it as necessary experience, even though it was painful. The depression that characterized that period is still accessible, still something she could slip back into if she stopped actively maintaining her psychological health, but it's no longer her default state. Simon writes letters to Betty sometimes, even though he can't send them. The letters help him process ongoing grief, provide structure for emotions that might otherwise become overwhelming. He's not waiting for her return, but he's also not forgetting her, maintaining connection through memory and writing, while also building life that exists independently. Cake collects objects from their adventures, creates elaborate displays throughout the house that document their travels. Her collections are idiosyncratic and personally meaningful, making sense to her feline sensibilities. The collections turn their home into a living museum of their shared history, evidence that they've done things and been places and survived experiences that seemed impossible. Time passes strangely when your home exists in pocket dimension, adjacent to multiple universes with different temporal flows. They age, but not at consistent rate. It doesn't matter much. They've all accepted that ordinary human lifespans don't quite apply to dimensional travelers with their particular circumstances. The ending that isn't ending is just continuation, is them choosing each day to keep existing together, to maintain the home and family and routines they've built. There's no dramatic climax, no final battle or ultimate resolution, just three damaged beings who found each other in chaos, who built something meaningful from shared survival, who decided that living together is better than any of their alternatives. Fionna looks out at her garden and feels something she barely recognizes as peace. Not the peace of problems solved or questions answered, but the peace of accepting that problems and questions are permanent features of existence, and that's okay. She exists, ambiguously, but definitely. She matters to Cake and Simon and Prismo. She has purpose, not cosmic or predetermined, but constructed through daily choices. Simon looks up from his research and sees Fionna through the doorway, recognizes the expression on her face as one he's felt himself recently. The expression of someone who has decided to be alive not just biologically, but psychologically, who has chosen engagement over withdrawal. They make eye contact, share moment of mutual recognition, return to their separate activities with the comfort of knowing they're not alone. Cake bursts in with characteristic enthusiasm, wanting to show Fionna and Simon her latest accomplishment. They indulge her, appreciate her triumph, engage with her joy in ways that would have been impossible for either of them in their states of deepest depression. The moment is ordinary and perfect, encapsulating what their family has become. Beings showing up for each other in small ways that accumulate into profound connection. The multiverse continues its infinite complications around them. Somewhere, other Fionnas and other Simons navigate other circumstances, make different choices, live different versions of similar stories. But this Fionna, this Simon, this Cake, they found something worth maintaining. They've built home not from perfect materials, but from their own damage and determination, and the simple fact of choosing each other repeatedly over time. And that's enough. It's not everything anyone might have wanted, not the fairy tale ending where all problems are solved, but it's real and sustainable and theirs. Three beings living with ambiguity and loss and unexpected family, choosing continued existence, not because it's easy, but because they've discovered it can be meaningful. The story continues because lives continue, and sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply keep going together, building meaning from the raw materials of survival and care and the daily decision to remain present for each other. The garden needs tending, the library needs organizing, the multiverse needs navigating. And Fionna, Simon, and Cake will do these things together in their home dimension that exists because they chose to build it, surrounded by evidence of their shared survival, committed to futures that remain uncertain but no longer feel unbearable. They are real enough, together enough, alive enough. And for beings who have known the depths of despair and displacement, That is a victory worth celebrating in quiet, everyday ways that accumulate into lives worth living.